Jack Miller lived alone in a rundown apartment in the Bronx, one of the roughest neighborhoods in New York City. His apartment was on the second floor of an old brick building. The kind with cracked walls covered in graffiti and windows taped over with plastic sheets. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the yellowed walls smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. Outside, the constant hum of traffic mixed with the occasional scream or gunshot echoing from a nearby alley. Jack wasn't exactly a sociable man. He worked at a small repair shop at the corner of the street, fixing old fans, radios, and whatever broken appliances people brought in. The shop barely made enough money to cover his bills. But Jack had learned to live with less. He didn't talk much to his neighbors, who were mostly struggling families, drug addicts, and old folks who had long given up on life. The only companion Jack had was a black cat named Shadow. He had found Shadow one rainy night, shivering under a pile of trash bags. The cat had followed him home, curled up at the foot of his bed, and never left. Shadow was quiet and independent, but at night, he would jump onto Jack's lap and curl up, purring softly. Jack didn't know why, but having Shadow around made the apartment feel a little less empty. It was a cold night in late autumn when things started getting strange. Jack was sitting at the small wooden table in his kitchen, eating a bowl of instant noodles while Shadow sat nearby, licking his paw. Suddenly, Shadow's ears perked up, and he darted toward the door. Jack frowned, putting down his chopsticks. "What's up, Shadow?" Shadow meowed and walked toward the door. Jack stood up and followed. When he opened the door, Shadow was sitting proudly beside a bundle on the worn doormat. Jack bent down and his breath hitched in his throat. It was a stack of crisp, neatly wrapped $100 bills, at least a few $1,000s worth. Jack picked it up slowly, feeling the texture of the bills. His mind raced. Where the hell had Shadow found this? His eyes darted nervously down the hallway, but no one was there. He closed the door and locked it. Sitting back at the table, Jack counted the money, $5,000. He glanced at Shadow, who had settled back down near the radiator. "Where the hell did you get this?" he whispered. Shadow blinked lazily, curled his tail around his paws, and purred. Jack sat back in his chair, his pulse racing. The next morning, Jack walked down to the corner shop for a cup of coffee. The woman behind the counter, an older lady named Mrs. Johnson, smiled at him. "Morning, Jack," she said. "You look pale. You okay?" Jack hesitated. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well." He stirred his coffee, glancing at the people walking by the store window. A group of teenagers in hoodies were standing near the bus stop, smoking and laughing. Across the street, a man in a puffy jacket was talking to someone in a black car with tinted windows. It was the usual scene in the Bronx: drugs, poverty, and desperation. "Hey," Jack said suddenly, "has anyone lost any money around here?" Mrs. Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Money? In this neighborhood? Honey, nobody's got money to lose." Jack forced a smile and finished his coffee. He walked back home, still thinking about the money. It was too much to be random. Someone had to have left it there. But who, and why? That night, as Jack sat down to eat, Shadow jumped up onto the table, staring at him with his green eyes. Jack scratched behind his ear. "Where did you find that money?" "Huh?" Shadow's tail swayed. Then, without warning, he jumped down from the table and walked toward the bedroom. Jack watched as Shadow slipped under the bed. A few seconds later, Shadow returned, carrying another bundle of cash in his mouth. Jack shot to his feet. "Jesus, Shadow." He rushed over, taking the bundle from Shadow's mouth. Another $5,000. Jack stared at the money, his heart pounding. He dropped it onto the table, breathing heavily. What the hell is going on? Jack sat down, his hands trembling. He knew there was only one way to get answers. He needed to know where Shadow was getting the money from. Jack searched through his closet until he found an old security camera that he had installed years ago when someone broke into his apartment. He spent half an hour setting it up, positioning the camera to face his bedroom and the space beneath his bed. "Okay, Shadow," Jack muttered. "Let's see what you've been up to." That night, Jack turned off the lights and sat in front of his laptop, watching the live feed from the camera. Shadow was curled up on the windowsill, but around midnight, he stood up and stretched. Then, he walked toward the bed. Jack leaned forward. Shadow slid under the bed. And after a few seconds, his head reappeared, dragging a small fabric pouch between his teeth. Jack's eyes widened. He paused the video and crawled toward the bed. Lifting the mattress, he saw what Shadow had been working on. There was a small gap between the wooden floorboards beneath the bed. Shadow had scratched away the edges, revealing a dark compartment underneath. Jack reached down and pulled at the loose board. The compartment opened to reveal a wooden box, old and scratched. Jack pulled it out, setting it carefully on the bed. The box was heavy. His heart raced as he lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of $100 bills, tightly bound with faded rubber bands. Jack's mouth went dry. He pulled out the money and underneath it was an envelope, yellowed with age. Jack opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper. A letter. Jack, if you're reading this, it means I'm not here anymore. I've saved this money for you, bit by bit over the years. I never told you because I wanted you to stand on your own 2 feet. But if you've found it, it means you need it now. Use it wisely. Love, Mom. Jack's throat tightened. His hands shook as he folded the letter and held it to his chest. His mother had died nearly 10 years ago. He had always thought she left nothing behind, just a broken apartment and memories of their fights. But she had left this. She had been planning for him all along. Jack sank onto the bed, the letter still in his hand. Shadow jumped up beside him, pressing his soft body against Jack's side. Jack whispered, "Mom, I'm so sorry." Shadow curled up on his lap. And for the first time in years, Jack let the tears fall. Jack sat on the edge of his bed, the letter from his mother resting on his lap. His hands trembled as he folded the delicate paper and placed it back into the wooden box. The stacks of money lay on the bed beside him, crisp and neatly bundled. Tens of thousands of dollars. More money than Jack had seen in his entire life. Shadow sat next to the box, his tail flicking lazily as if he had nothing to do with the fact that Jack's life had just turned upside down. Jack scratched the back of his head, his mind racing. How the hell did you even find this?" Jack whispered, looking at Shadow. Shadow just stared at him with those wide, green eyes. Jack sighed and leaned back against the wall. His gaze drifted to the worn-out ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead. His apartment had always felt like a cage, a reminder of the life he'd built for himself after years of failure and bad decisions. But this money, it was enough to change everything. Or ruin it. Jack's mind wandered back to the last conversation he'd had with his mother. He was 22 at the time, fresh out of a mechanic apprenticeship and eager to open his own repair shop. His mother had told him it was a bad idea. "You don't know what you're getting into, Jack. You need more experience first." But Jack had been young, proud, and stupid. "You don't trust me," he had shouted at her. "You think I'm going to fail? Just like Dad, huh?" His mother had stood silently in the kitchen, her arms crossed. "I just don't want to see you get hurt, Jack. I don't need your help." And with that, he had left. He spent the next 3 years bouncing from one dead-end job to another, washing dishes, working in garages, and at one point, nearly getting arrested for fighting outside a bar. He came back only once, when he got a call from Mrs. Johnson telling him his mother was dying. By then, it was too late. She had been too weak to even sit up in bed. Jack had sat by her side, holding her hand, unable to find the right words. "I'm sorry, Mom," he had whispered. She had smiled weakly. "It's okay, Jack." And then she was gone. Jack squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the memories away. But now, 10 years later, it turned out his mother had never given up on him, while he was out making mistakes and wasting years of his life. She had been saving for him, preparing for the day he would need her. "What the hell am I supposed to do now?" he muttered. Shadow meowed softly and rubbed against his leg. Jack sighed and picked up one of the stacks of bills. 50 grand, he whispered. Where the hell did she even get this kind of money? Jack stood up and started pacing. There was no way his mother had made this kind of money working as a cleaner. The letter didn't mention where it came from, only that she had saved it for him. Is it stolen money? Jack wondered. Did she borrow it from someone? A loan shark? He ran a hand through his hair. His mother had always been cautious with money. Hell, she used to wash out plastic bags and reuse them. There was no way she'd gotten mixed up in something illegal. But what if someone came looking for it? Jack sat down, his heart pounding. He needed answers. And he knew exactly where to start. Jack stood outside Mrs. Johnson's apartment door, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He could hear the sound of the television playing on the other side of the door, some talk show host laughing. He knocked. Just a second. A moment later, Mrs. Johnson opened the door. She was wearing an old house robe, her graying hair tied back with a scarf. She smiled when she saw him. Jack, this is a surprise. You okay? I need to ask you something. Mrs. Johnson's smile faded. Come on in. Jack stepped inside. Her apartment was small but cozy, cluttered with framed pictures of her grandkids and crocheted blankets draped over the back of the sofa. Sit down, honey. I'll put some tea on. Jack sat on the couch, his knee bouncing anxiously. Mrs. Johnson returned with 2 cups of tea and sat down beside him. So, she said, what's bothering you? Jack hesitated. Did my mom ever mention saving up money? Mrs. Johnson's face softened. Oh, so you found it. Jack's eyes widened. You knew? Mrs. Johnson sighed. Your mom, she was a proud woman. Jack, she didn't like asking for help, even when she needed it. After you left, she started working extra jobs, cleaning houses during the day, working at the laundromat at night. She even took in sewing work for some of the ladies at church. Jack swallowed. How much did she save? Mrs. Johnson hesitated. She never told me the full amount. But I know some of it came from a settlement. Jack's brow furrowed. Settlement? Mrs. Johnson nodded. Your dad's accident. Jack's chest tightened. I thought Dad didn't leave us anything. Well, your mother didn't want you to know. The settlement came years after his death, a workplace negligence claim. Your mom didn't spend any of it. She said it belonged to you. Jack felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. He leaned forward, rubbing his hands over his face. I didn't know. Mrs. Johnson's eyes softened. She was saving it for you, Jack, for when you were ready. Jack shook his head. I don't deserve this, after the way I treated her. Mrs. Johnson reached over and squeezed his hand. Jack, your mom loved you. She didn't care about the mistakes you made. She just wanted you to be okay. Jack's throat tightened. He pulled his hand away and stood up. Thank you for telling me. Mrs. Johnson smiled. What are you going to do with it? Jack hesitated. He looked toward the window, where the gray buildings of the Bronx stood under the cloudy sky. I don't know yet. Jack walked home through the dimly lit streets of the Bronx, his mind racing. His mother had left him a gift, a way out. He could finally leave this neighborhood. Hell, he could probably buy a small house somewhere out west. Start over. But the faces of the kids on the street haunted him. The ones hanging out near the bus stop, smoking. The ones wearing oversized jackets, walking with that hardened edge of someone who had already seen too much violence. Jack knew exactly what kind of future awaited them if nothing changed. He also knew he could change it. But why should I? Jack thought. Why should I sacrifice my chance for a better life? His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Joe, an old friend from his wilder days. Jack hesitated before answering. Hey, man. Joe's voice came through. Heard you came into some money. Jack's jaw tightened. Who told you that? Joe laughed. Small neighborhood. Jack, word travels fast. So, you need some help figuring out how to spend it? Jack sighed. I don't think so. Joe, come on, man. We could hit Vegas, double your money, or better yet, get out of this dump for good. Jack stared down the street at a group of kids sitting on the curb. He knew exactly what his mother would have wanted him to do. I'll think about it, Jack said, but he already knew the answer. Jack sat on the steps of his apartment building, a cigarette burning between his fingers. He wasn't a regular smoker, but tonight felt like the kind of night that called for it. Across the street, 2 kids in oversized jackets were passing around a joint. A police cruiser rolled by slowly, and the kids melted into the shadows. Shadow was curled up at Jack's feet, his tail flicking lazily. Jack took a slow drag from the cigarette and stared down the street. The Bronx had always been a hard place to live, but Jack had never known any different. He grew up in these streets, learned how to fight, learned how to survive, but now, for the first time, he had a way out. 50 grand. Jack thought. Hell, I could leave tonight. Get on a bus. Go west, California maybe. Start over. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't need to check the screen to know it was Joe. Jack sighed, took another drag, and picked up the call. Jack. Joe's voice came through, smooth and low. You had time to think about my offer? Jack rubbed his temple. I don't know. Joe. Look, man, 50 grand is nice, but you could make it 100. 200, easy. You just have to know how to play it. Jack's jaw tightened. And let me guess, you know how to play it. Joe laughed. Come on, Jack, you know how it works. I've got some contacts in Atlantic City. Hell, I know a guy who could turn that 50 into 200 grand in a weekend. Jack leaned his head back, blowing out a stream of smoke toward the cold night sky. And if I lose? Joe's voice darkened. Then you try again. Jack's eyes narrowed. Or I end up in debt to the wrong people. Joe chuckled. That's the game, Jack. Jack's grip on the phone tightened. He knew Joe. He'd known guys like him his whole life, the smooth talkers. The hustlers. The ones who always knew how to make a quick buck but never seemed to keep it. Jack knew exactly where that road led. Nah, Joe, he said, I'm good. There was a long pause. You sure about that? Joe asked. Jack looked down at Shadow, who was watching him with those deep green eyes. The cat's tail curled around his paws. Yeah, Jack said, I'm sure. Joe sighed. Suit yourself. Jack hung up and tossed the cigarette into the gutter. He sat there for a long time, listening to the distant sound of sirens. The next morning, Jack woke up to the sound of pounding on his door. Shadow hissed and darted under the couch. Jack rolled out of bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Yeah, hold on. He opened the door to find Detective Riley standing in the hallway. Riley was tall, sharp-featured, and had the kind of face that looked like it had seen too much of the world. His gray suit was wrinkled, and his badge glinted under the hallway light. Jack Miller? Jack frowned. Yeah? Riley pulled out a small notebook and flipped it open. Mind if I come in? Jack hesitated. What's this about? Riley smiled faintly. Why don't you let me in? And we'll talk about it. Jack stepped aside reluctantly and closed the door behind them. Riley took a seat at the small kitchen table and crossed his legs. You work at the repair shop down the street, right? Riley asked. Yeah. How long you been there? Couple of years. Riley nodded. Funny thing, couple of weeks ago, there was a robbery in Queens. Convenience store. The guy made off with about 50 grand in cash. Jack's spine stiffened. And yesterday, the convenience store owner got a call from someone saying they knew where the money was. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. You accusing me of something? Jack said. Riley smiled faintly. Not yet, but you can understand why it's suspicious. A guy like you, working at a repair shop for minimum wage, suddenly sitting on a pile of cash? Jack stood. I think you should leave. Riley didn't move. Where'd the money come from? Jack? Jack's fists clenched. It's none of your damn business. Actually, it is, Riley said, because if you don't have a good answer, this conversation is going to happen again, in an interrogation room. Jack's chest tightened. It's not stolen, he said through gritted teeth. Riley leaned back in his chair. Good, then I'm sure you won't mind if I look around. Jack stepped forward. You got a warrant? Riley smiled faintly. Not yet. Jack took a step toward him. Then get the hell out of my apartment. Riley stood, adjusting his tie. No problem, but let me give you a piece of advice. Jack, if you're sitting on dirty money, it's going to catch up with you sooner or later. Jack opened the door and gestured for him to leave. Riley smiled thinly as he stepped into the hallway. See you around, Jack. Jack slammed the door shut and locked it. He leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Shadow padded over, rubbing against his leg. Jack dropped down to the floor and ran his hand over Shadow's fur. This is bad, he whispered. Shadow meowed softly and climbed into Jack's lap. Jack closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He needed to figure out what to do with the money, fast. Jack sat at the repair shop later that day, disassembling an old fan. His hands moved automatically, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying Riley's words in his head. If you're sitting on dirty money, it's going to catch up with you sooner or later. Joe's words came back to him too. Double your money. Jack cursed under his breath and put down the screwdriver. Across the street, he saw Mrs. Johnson helping a young mother carry her groceries up the steps of her apartment. The woman's coat was thin and patched in places. Her little boy, no older than 6, was clutching a ragged teddy bear. Jack stared at them for a long time. He thought about his mother, how she had worked herself to the bone to give him a chance at a better life. And what had he done with it? He'd thrown it away. Now, she was giving him a second chance. But was the money really meant for him? Or was it meant for something bigger? That evening, Jack found himself walking towards St. Mary's Community Center at the edge of the neighborhood. He had passed by the place 100 times but had never gone inside. It was a small, brick building with a faded sign above the door. Jack pushed open the door. Inside, a few folding tables were set up, and a woman was handing out meals to a line of homeless men and women. A man in a white shirt and tie was stacking boxes nearby. "Can I help you?" the man asked. Jack hesitated. I want to make a donation." The man smiled. "Sure, we accept cash or check." Jack pulled the bundle of money from his jacket pocket and set it on the table. The man's eyes widened. You're serious?" Jack nodded. The man picked up the bundle and flipped through the bills. "This is 10 grand. Jack shrugged. "It's a start." The man stared at him. "What's your name?" Jack smiled faintly. "Jack Miller." The man extended his hand. "You just changed a lot of lives." Jack shook his hand. "I hope so." As Jack turned to leave, Shadow rubbed against his leg and let out a soft purr. Jack reached down and scratched behind his ear. "Let's see if we can make this a habit," Jack said. Shadow meowed in agreement.